Hi everyone, welcome back to training session 2 of Ambiguous Loss Counselling. I'm sorry that we're unable to catch up this evening, but I think that everything that we had originally talked about in the first training session and the reflections that I sent through can be easily translated to this one. I will share my screen soon, but I guess I just wanted to go back in time and pause a little bit in terms of where we got to that Saturday morning, talking about the experience of Missing Persons Ireland and the ways in which you were engaging with people that contacted the helpline, as well as exploring some of your own lived experiences of ambiguous loss and the ways in which you would merge that lived and learnt experience in terms of the ways that you might better support people now who are searching for help in relation to long-term missing people, but also those that contact you in the future. I've provided a little video for the anniversary event talking about the intersection between policing and missing persons and the ways in which police are unintentional support providers of families where they have long-term relationships with them because of the ways in which they can come together to try and search for the missing person. And the ways in which we need to value that relationship from both sides, both from the ways in which families interact with police, but also the ways in which police can support families to minimise some of that continual trauma of having someone missing. Now, in our first training, we covered an introduction to ambiguous loss. We really talked about that power of knowing what ambiguous loss is, about giving a name to the concept, about what happens for families when they carry around all of these feelings of ambiguity and being able to name that for them, to be able to talk about the fact that it isn't necessarily a grief and bereavement response, that it's both the intersections of trauma and shock and ambiguity and sadness and grief, combining together in terms of the ways in which people might be able to share their losses with others. We also talked about that silencing of that grief. What happens when the grief is disenfranchised, when people around you don't necessarily understand what you're going through? That it's not as simple as just waiting for periods of time and that loss getting better, but sometimes that loss feeling worse over time because you have to live with all these intersections of not knowing, about being really confused about all of the likelihoods about what might have happened to your missing person, and sometimes seeing other missing persons cases resolved before yours. When I talk to you all about the words that you feel most connected with in terms of ambiguous loss, many of you spoke about that sense of living in limbo, that the term unresolved grief was really powerful and helpful. I did also caution the use of the word grief because dependent on how the person is missing, it will depend on whether or not the families want to name the concept of grief. So my suggestion is never name the concept for families. Talk to them about the concepts of ambiguous loss, unresolved grief, living in limbo, and see which concepts might feel closer to what families are experiencing. I think in the second half of that first session of training, we really talked about the practical and emotional impacts, where Dermot said that really at the beginning, people just want hope, that they don't want to be told that they're going to be living with this long term. But the reality is we're not psychics. We don't know how long people will be waiting for news. They might contact you and the next day there might be a resolution. They might contact you and 10 years later they're still waiting for a resolution. There's a real complex engagement of that teasing journey of hope, of people being hopeful and hopeless all at the same time. I sent through some of the counselling framework suggestions for you to look at about those intersections and how you as support providers to people can hold space for that teasing journey of hope. I think that ambiguous loss shows up differently for different people. When someone is a victim of a crime and they're missing, the experiences of families left behind are going to be different than someone who has gone missing because of a complex mental health condition or they're at risk of suicide. It doesn't mean that one is worse than others. It means that their connection to what might have happened to the person will be shaped by the experiences of what happened when the person vanished. I think that there's still a lot of stigma around being the family member of a long-term missing person. That there's almost a mystical concept in the community around what happens when people vanish. People consume it as entertainment, as media. They watch movies, they listen to podcasts. That stigma of living the reality of a family left behind when someone's missing is important for your work in terms of really encouraging people to talk broadly, not just about the person and their missing status, but the person and what they miss about them. I think when we can shift those conversations, that becomes really impactful for people who are left behind. The last two practical aspects that I really wanted to touch on that we looked at in that first session of training was around the role of the media and the role of the police. I think that providing practical advice to families is key to navigating the loss of a missing person. Not everyone will want to talk about the emotional aspects of that loss, either at the beginning, 6 months in, a year in, or 10 years in. The searching aspects, the requests for police to step up and help them, and for the media to really respect the stories of families left behind is what's at the forefront of good work in missing persons. So the next session, so the one that I'm going to be talking about today, I identified was really about, well, what is the role of counselling and emotional support? What are some of those theoretical standpoints we can look at around what actually helps families of missing people? If you're going to refer them on to counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, what's important for those interactions to be shaped by? I'm going to touch on the idea of what is the role of hope and how you can support people better in order to help themselves. Our goal always is not to stand by people forever as support people, but eventually become redundant because we build people up to the space in which they can stand and weather the concepts of ambiguous loss. Making those relationships reliant on each other, making people reliant on contacting helplines or contacting support people all of the time is never the goal. The goal is to arm people with information, hold space for them while they navigate the complexities, and then help them to consider how they might tolerate not knowing for however long their person is going to be missing for. As I talk through session 2, I'll note times that I'd like you to stop and pause and reflect and speak amongst each other. There's no right or wrong way of navigating ambiguous loss, just like there's no right or wrong way of supporting people in terms of what you do. But I will say that the words that families have reflected with me over the years is that they don't like the word closure. They don't like being told to give up on hope, and they don't like being told new ideas about what might have happened to their missing person. Every story you will present a family with, they have already thought of, either when they're talking with the police or during the night when they can't sleep. Our role is to listen, reflect, support, and acknowledge that this type of loss is incredibly difficult. To remind people that there are others like them, to create opportunities for people to come together, and to create opportunities to advocate on behalf of families when navigating the police, coronial systems, victims of crime spaces, the justice sector, and the media. So that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I'll also send through these slides for us to look at later on. But what I will do is I will press play and we'll begin. So welcome to session 2 of the Ambiguous Loss training. My name's Dr. Sarah Wayland. I'm regularly publishing on all areas in relation to missing persons and suicide prevention. The easiest way for you to follow on with some of the ideas that I have is just simply by Googling my name whenever the idea comes to you. And all of my new publications are available for people to read online, usually by Google Scholar. So have a look there, and I'll also send through information that might be important. So whilst we looked last time at really those defining concepts about what is ambiguous loss, this time we're going to talk about what's the role of emotional support and counselling. What we know from international evidence that across people's lifetime, they're likely to only ever attend one counselling session in their life for a whole range of issues. I know many people, and let's face it, sometimes it's quite gendered. A lot of men that will say, I would never go and talk to a counsellor. I'd never engage in therapy. It's not for me. Some people might be repetitive attenders at counselling sessions. Some people might go at times where things are difficult and they just need some help navigating that space. And some people might have tried it once and just thought, this isn't for me. There's nothing technical about how we suggest counselling to people. The suggestion of counselling is not because people aren't coping, but to look for ways in which they can strengthen their own resolve, to kind of co-design with a counsellor some ways in which they might live their lives in a way that they might feel a little bit more in control. Counselling will never fix the issues related to an ambiguous loss. It will never bring the person back. You'll never be able to workshop what you could be doing better for searching. But it's a private space to be able to talk about living between hopefulness and hopelessness. What I uncovered in my doctoral study was that there were very much private narratives of hope for people who had someone missing. That what they said openly in the public, to the media, to others, even when they contacted services like yours, their story of how they were coping was sometimes different than their private story. Their feelings towards the missing person were sometimes different than what they told other people. Their sense of how they were going to manage to live their life alongside this significant trauma was often far darker and far more difficult to sit with and understand in the counselling room. So don't discount counselling as an opportunity for people to be able to speak their truth about living with the loss of a missing person. The reality is a lot of counsellors aren't trained. Well, most counsellors aren't trained on navigating an ambiguous loss. If you Google my name and counselling framework for missing persons, there's an information toolkit available online that counsellors can access wherever they are around the globe. It just provides some space to acknowledge what are the theoretical assumptions that we need to consider when we provide counselling, and what are the actual models that might be useful that have an evidence base that show how we can better support people who are left behind. So I'm just going to touch on some of these today, and I know that many of you aren't trained counsellors, but you are peer support workers. You're people in the community supporting others. And that means that you should have an understanding of the theories that inform why it's possible to support people when they've got someone missing. Now, the first session a month ago was really about understanding the theory of ambiguous loss. Remember that some of you touched on that point of feeling more comfortable to talk about it as an unresolved grief. But ambiguous loss is really about acknowledging that the person is physically not here, but you don't know whether or not they're coming back. That space between here or not is the loss that we provide space to understand. Another theoretical concept developed by an American, Therese Rando, looks at the concept of complicated or anticipatory mourning. That means waiting for a grief to happen. Some of you might think about these concepts in terms of where they apply in other grief experiences in life. If you've ever supported somebody through palliative care, you're very much anticipating the mourning that's going to come. If you've ever watched someone live with a degenerative condition, you might be anticipating the mourning that's going to come. If you've lost someone where they're not your next of kin, or they're not someone that typically we would view as a close connection to you, but you still feel that loss, that's sometimes complicated mourning. Or where you lose someone and the relationship wasn't great. Are you still allowed to grieve the loss of that person? That's also complicated mourning. So you can see how that fits quite nicely with missing persons. For some families that I've worked with who've eventually gone on to locate the remains of their loved one, they talked about the fact that when their loved one was located, that they hadn't gotten a head start on grief, that there was no dress rehearsal for their grief. They did anticipate in the darkness of the night, or sometimes in safe spaces, that yes, their missing person might be found deceased, that they'd anticipated how they might react, how they might step through that process of moving into that grief and bereavement space. But sometimes the complications of having someone missing is that there might be a significant period of time between when they were lost and when they were found. I often tell the story that a family that I worked with a very long time ago, their son had been missing for 5 years. And when he was eventually located, a couple of months later, we were all at a collaborative meeting together, community support workers and families of missing people advocating for others. And at that meeting, this family were presented with a big bunch of flowers. And the flowers were given to them saying that we wanted to acknowledge, we, meaning the community, not me, we wanted to acknowledge the great news about the fact that their son had been found. And I thought to myself, in what universe do we talk about the loss of a child as good news? Yet the complication of mourning associated with someone being missing means that often someone is found a long period of time afterwards, and it's almost as if people suggest that it takes away the rawness of that emotion because there's been time to catch up with the idea. And I can tell you, families that I've worked with, it doesn't matter if it's a week, a month, a year, 10 years later, the pain and the agony of locating the remains of that person are still going to be felt as if it happened straight away. Families of missing people experience that complicated mourning because often they'll say, why aren't I getting better at this? Why is it a year later and I'm still feeling worse rather than feeling better? If we think back to that ambiguity around the loss, when we don't know where somebody is, how can we get better when we're constantly bombarded with ideas or hope that they might come back? And the final theoretical concept that we often use is disenfranchised grief, which just is a fancy way of saying a grief that is not commonly recognised in the community. Similar to some of those ideas around the complications of mourning, what our relationship is to the person. But purely by the name missing, we disenfranchise people's grief. We don't say the loss of a person who's missing, we say a missing person. That dangles the idea that perhaps they'll come back. So we can't really step into the grief world, but we can't step out of the living world either. So that disenfranchised grief is usually the one that sits outside the expected losses that we think will happen in our lifetime. We anticipate, as much as we try not to say it, that there will be a cradle to grave concept of how most people live their lives, that they're born, they go to school, they step into being an adult, they engage in relationships, a career, they grow older, and then they pass away. When we have unexpected losses, like the loss of a child before the parents have passed away, like the sudden or traumatic disappearance of a person, when someone is lost because they're a victim of a crime, where a loss occurs in a way that we hadn't anticipated that usually happens. Those feelings of disenfranchised grief means that families of missing people aren't necessarily understood by the wider community. If you think about posting information on Facebook and the comments that people make, you'll see when there might be long-term missing persons cases shown in the media, the comment section will always say things like, I'm hoping for closure for them. You know, a body has been found. That's great. The family finally have closure. When families talk about holding on to hope, they're often reminded, isn't it time that they gave up hope? We have these unspoken rules about how long people should grieve for, and families of missing people don't neatly fit into those. So we need to remember that in terms of some of those theoretical concepts that are relevant. So I like to think of theories like a big kind of umbrella statement. in relation to how we might engage or understand the experience of that loss. Underneath that is the counselling toolkit that counsellors might use. So if you have a family that's contacting you and they're asking, can you refer me to somebody in the community? You might think, well, do I send them to a grief counsellor? Where else do I send them? So some of these ideas might help you with those referral pathways. Once I've stepped through these, I'd like you to press pause and just talk amongst yourselves about all of the different referral pathways you can think of, that you're aware of in your communities, that might be helpful to different types of families of missing people. So the first one, and often when I say to people, well, what sort of counsellor would people look for? They often say bereavement counsellors. Yet I can say, given my vast practical experience working with families versus the research work that I've done for the second half of my career, in that first half of engaging with people in the counselling room, most people said that they were there for specific missing persons counselling because of the trauma of what a bereavement counsellor had said to them. And there's no disrespect for bereavement counsellors, they do great work. But that moving through of the grief and loss experience in terms of accepting that the loss had occurred is not relevant to families of missing people most of the time. When people felt that they were pushed in the direction of accepting what had the fate of the missing person without the missing person's body being located, or when the investigation was still open, was not helpful, and people felt silenced and misunderstood by the support person they were reaching out to. So that's where, when we're thinking about counselling, sometimes trauma counselling is more relevant to families of missing people. It means that those trauma therapy models really understand the circumstances, like we talked about last time, about why someone's missing. If they were abducted, it's about working through the absolute agony and fear and shock of what might be happening to that person whilst they're missing still. The trauma also acknowledges what might have happened to their remains, where they might be. Are they out in the open? Are they exposed to the elements? But it also offers opportunities for post-traumatic growth. We know from some of the work that I've done, some of the work of George Bonanno in the US, that talks about the other side of sadness. That not everyone exposed to a significant loss will continue being sad for the rest of their lives. It doesn't mean that they'll just get on with things and they'll feel okay, but it does mean that there's opportunities to grow from the loss that has happened. Like many of you who have lived experience of having someone missing, you've used that post-traumatic time point to grow and think about ways in which you can help others. People that write books, speak in the media, go on speaking tours, develop a podcast, provide information to other families of missing people. The work of the Missing Persons Advocacy Network is spearheaded by Lauren O'Keefe in response to the trauma of the loss of her brother. So those trauma therapy models don't just acknowledge the trauma that somebody's had, but also the ways in which they might grow from that and make meaning because of the sadness of what's happened to them. Another model that's useful is narrative therapy. It's about using the approach to make sure that people's stories are heard and validated and explored, to really get to the core about what it means for families to lose that person. It also helps in terms of mapping the impact of that person being missing. For many families in the mental health space, the loss that they experience is not just about the day that the person disappeared. It could have been a really long history of navigating the health system, of the peaks and troughs of that person being well or unwell, about unraveling that story of the person as well as their missingness, about giving people the power to tell their stories in a safe space. Some of the others that I like to explore is also some of the ideas around healing narratives. Arthur Frank talks about, in a beautiful book called The Wounded Storyteller, thinks about the ways in which people can uncover their own stories because of their trauma. But people understand their stories in different ways. For some people, it might be a restitution narrative, It's just about the retelling of the missing person's story to make sense of it through the facts that are available to you. The chaos narrative might be really trying to dig deep and try and understand the storm, the thunder and the lightning that kind of happens with the range of emotions and those constant thoughts that happen for families when they're ruminating all of the time about the missing person. Where are they? When are they going to come back? Are they safe? Are they fed? Are they warm? That chaos narrative in terms of helping unravel that and provide a space for it. And the quest narrative is really about trying to help people to reframe that experience of ambiguous loss and locate some anchor or connection for them in the midst of the turbulence. I think what I learnt, particularly from the families that shared their stories with me during my PhD, is that anchor point of learning how they worked out how to tolerate the ambiguity was the key point for families living alongside the loss of the missing person. So I'd just like you to pause for a moment and talk about what options are available in terms of where you live, where the families are that are connected to your service, and how you might think more broadly than just sending people along to bereavement counsellors to try and understand the loss that they're experiencing. So now that you've done that work, and if you haven't, I'm going to ask you to press pause quickly now and do that work. Spend 10 or 15 minutes understanding it. Is I really wanted to centre on the idea of what about hope? One of the key reasons for doing my PhD is that I was driven bananas by the word hope. I kept hearing it in the counselling room. I kept hearing it when I was talking to the media. I kept reading it in the research. But I couldn't work out what it actually meant. What was the power of it for families of missing people? So what did I understand when I went and spoke to people about what's your relationship with hope when someone is missing? Because that was the key question of my PhD. It meant that I wasn't insinuating that everyone was hopeful, because not every family of missing person is. But I wanted to understand, where did hope turn up? What did it look like? What did it feel like? And what was your connection to it? So what I found in the multitudes of hours of transcripts of talking to people is that some people had very hope-filled explorations around their missing person. That wasn't a sense that somebody would come back and they'd just all happily get on with the rest of their life and it would be great. But the hopeful explorations were sometimes related to time, sometimes related to, I hope that I find out before I pass away what happened to my loved one. I hope that whoever was involved in the disappearance is brought to justice. I hope that the police continue to connect with me. I hope that I really understand the mindset that my loved one was in when they disappeared and whether or not they've found peace now. That those multiple weavings of both being hopeful and hopeless, which were those darker times where people were worried about people being exposed to the elements, that someone might be harming the person who was missing, that they would never find out what happened to them, that those multiple weavings were dependent on time and space. In the early days when someone's missing, if you've had someone missing for a couple of days, a week, 2 weeks, the conversations about hope are not relevant, because hope is very much related to, I just want to find them in the early days. What I found when I kept interviewing people at different time points was that after 6 months, people started to think, I hope that by the 1-year anniversary, I have some information that might help me understand this better. A lot of families, and this is really hard for families to hear, and I don't suggest that we say it to all families in the early days, but kind of 5 or 10 years on, they started to think about, what is my hope for me, as well as what is my hope for the missing person? That they were starting to provide some space to think about what's my hope in terms of surviving this, as well as still holding on to hope for their missing person. Hope in the early days is always about a reunion, a resolution, a reconnecting. As it gets longer, It's about really understanding, how am I going to live with this? How's my missing person going to survive out there? And what does that all mean for me in terms of the life that I'm living? It really stood out to me, so many of the stories that families shared with me about really trying to unravel what did hope actually mean for people. The mum of a missing son, who at that point in time was missing for 10 years, and that's coming up to about 8 years ago, and this young man is still missing now, so he's been missing for 18 years. She said to me, I think that there are two paths of hope. You've got a really different hope in the beginning. It's sharper. She talked about it being like a tree, that there were sharp twigs out there, that she was really focused on the outcome, that her son was missing, that he'd left all of his possessions at his home, that he'd gone for a walk in the bush, and she was hoping that he would be found and brought back. That it was very pointed in terms of what she wanted. But she also talked about the fact that her connections with hope were shaped around her personality. And I think sometimes we don't always understand that. You don't just become a type of person who's hopeful or hopeless when someone's missing. It is shaped by what sort of person you are. Are you naturally optimistic? Are you thinking positively? Are you hopeful that maybe other losses you've experienced in your life prepare you for some of the losses we go on to have? So this mum talked about how for her it came back to who she was. That if she had been a pessimistic person, she wasn't going to attach a lot to hope. But if you're optimistic, then yeah, I think that, hope exists in everything that happens in your life, and you channel it into different areas. She said that there were different branches of hope, and that tree grew over time while she waited for news about her son. That as time went on, that tree kind of started to be less sharp, that it started to flourish a bit with some new leaves, some new opportunities, and that therefore ideas about the future were softer. That it was a really hard hope when someone goes missing. So what I want you to think about is the power of the word hope. When we tell people to stay strong, when we suggest to them don't give up hope, what are we actually asking them to do? And what sort of things could we ask that allows them to say what their hope is? What are they hoping for? Has it changed this year? Has it changed from last year? Has it changed from last week? It's all going to be shaped by what sort of person you are and how you're feeling at any given time. When we don't ask people how they define hope when someone's missing, then we run the risk of disenfranchising their grief. If we suggest that the only pathway through this is to hold on to hope at all costs, then we don't provide opportunities for conversations that really, illuminate all of the complexities of what happens when someone goes missing. So individually, whether you grab a notepad or you just think to yourself, I want you to think about those different teasing ideas of hope, about what you think when you refer people on to counselling, about what do you want to achieve for them by doing that. That when we use sometimes those platitudes of holding on to hope, that we also need to remember that it's the hope that hurts when someone has someone missing. So just take a few moments to reflect on that, and then we can move on to the final slides. So this is where I want you to start to think about what happens if you pick up a phone call and someone's on the other end. You usually have your usual responses of how you respond to ambiguous loss. But I just want you to imagine that you're seeing somebody for the first time or talking to them for the first time. That they've had someone that's been missing for 15 years and people have told them that they live with complex grief, that they need to get over it, that they're socially isolated, that their grief has impacted the way that they connect with other family members, that it's hard to turn up for Christmas when everyone's happy and it's a time of togetherness, when they might feel that that huge hole in their life of having someone missing means that they're never going to feel connected to family again, that it's hard to socialise, that it's hard to be part of work, that they just want to be reunited with their child. For me, when I hear those stories, it takes me back to the first times that I started working with families of missing people almost 20 years ago. But my first thought would have been a pervasive sadness about how lonely ambiguous loss is. That I might have thought around some ways in which I could magic away their sadness and say something that would make them feel better. I guess over time, I've also learnt that it's not my job, and it's not the job of support people to fix families of missing people, but to hold space for them to talk about the realities of having someone who's missing. I think when we think about cold cases, even the term cold cases means that how do you provide warmth and connection and space for somebody when the label that we associate with missing persons cases is so foreign and so disconnected from the relationships that we might have had with that missing person. So just think about what can you reflect on in terms of your own work that you do, whether you're a support person or a counsellor, or you have family members who've got someone missing, or you've got someone missing yourself. How can you honour those stirrings within around what are we triggered by? When we call things complicated grief, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, it's almost like a deficit-based approach. I think for me, what I've learnt over the years from families of missing people is the innate power and strength that they have to keep turning up every day, to keep searching for information, to keep waiting for the police to call, to keep connecting with the police even when they don't get the answers that they want. I think when we work with families like the ones I've presented, it's about understanding what their grief is about. It's about letting go of the shoulds, about they should be connecting with family, they should be socialising, they should be able to manage work. And what does it mean for them to live their life alongside the loss that they're experiencing at the same time? Our goal in any type of support we do, whether we're a clinical counsellor, a peer support worker, somebody who answers the phone, or we have a cup of tea with someone at a missing persons event, is that the role of counselling is not to fix families of missing people, but it's to take into account the fact that it's a teasing journey of hopefulness and hopelessness, that you need to listen to the lived experience of that person about how they are navigating their loss. Thinking of the fact that it's not just grief and bereavement, that it's trauma, that there are opportunities for people to tell their stories, to not heal completely from them, but to heal in a way that they've been heard. Because if we do those things, then people are going to be responded to in a better way so that they continue to seek out support however that looks for them. It might not be in the therapy space. It might be constantly calling services. It might be posting online all of the time on Facebook about their loss. It might be writing a book or speaking to the media. Whatever that is, the lived experience is paramount, because every missing persons case is different. Pauline Boss tells us in her landmark book that closure is not the goal in providing support to people left behind. We don't get them to a point where it's all fixed, even if the missing person hasn't come back. There is no such thing as closure. But if we remain person-centred, if we listen to people's stories, that we're open to learning about their loss, not telling them what their loss will feel like, even if it extends into the long term, that is key. Ask people, tell me about your person who's missing. Tell me what you miss about them. Tell me what keeps you awake at night. Tell me what you understand your connection hope to be. What does it look like and it feel like to you? Is there a little space for you and your life in the midst of this insurmountable loss? What does that look like to give yourself just a little bit of time for you and your life and navigating that? We can't tell people that it'll get better in the future. Not all missing people are found. Some people wait forever, and that's the reality of it. But people do learn to connect with a higher power whether that be through religion or spirituality or their hobbies or their connections or coming together and sharing their lived experience with others. People do find a way to keep getting up every morning, but they have to be listened to in order to co-design or co-construct this idea of living alongside their ambiguous loss. But, and this is the big but, and the key that I really want people to take away, that if you are supporting families of missing people, then the first step is that you have to be okay with tolerating the unknown, that you have to be okay with not being able to answer everyone's questions, that in whatever way you provide support, if you're okay with not knowing the end of the story, then you're providing a safe space for families of missing people. Because the complexity of an ambiguous loss means that people have to live at the same time, like Pauline Boss says, with both the person being here and the person gone. If you can get your head around that, then you provide a safe space for families of missing people. So I'm just going to leave you with that. As always, happy to hear your thoughts, happy to provide any more resources that you might need, and keep doing wonderful things and supporting families of missing people. Thanks so much for your time, and I wish you lots of luck for the rest of the year and thinking through the ways in which you can better support people. Thanks a lot.